Some of you may have come across the term Ugarit or Ugaritic. Ugaritic is a language, Ugarit is a location. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the place Ugarit with relationship to the book of Psalms. So Tel Rosh Shamra was a late Bronze Age city-state in northern Syria, close to the Mediterranean coast. It is just north of modern Latakia, about 200 miles north of Tyre. The modern tell or mound rises about 60 feet above the surrounding plain. The current tell encompasses an area of 50 acres, but some of the tell has been lost to erosion. Excavations first began at Rosh Shamra in 1929 by French archaeologists, and there are still archaeological excavations going on there even today. Ugarit was occupied between 6500 BC and 2200 BC. That's a long time ago. And then it was reoccupied from about 2000 to about 1180. So it's a pretty old tell. And as you might imagine, it would then have some relevance to the more archaic portions of the Bible, particularly some of the Psalms and poetic literature, but also with respect to the Pentateuch. The late Bronze settlement contained a palace complex and a temple acropolis in which the temple of Baal and the temple of Dagon were situated. The high point of Ugaritic civilization occurred between the 15th and 13th centuries BC. During the late Bronze occupation, Ugarit produced thousands of texts written in cuneiform alphabetic script. Both the language and script are Ugaritic. The language is a Northwest Semitic language, closely related to Biblical Hebrew, using the same syntax and much of the same vocabulary. You probably can't make it out too well unless you've studied some Ugaritic or Akkadian, but it is a wedge-shaped script. So the scribes would take a stylus made out of a papyrus reed, press it into clay, and form the characters. Now, unlike Akkadian, Ugaritic is an alphabetic script, so that falls in line with the other Northwest Semitic languages, such as Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, and the such. Some of the some of the texts that you might recognize from the Ugaritic corpus include the Epic of Baal, Legend of Dan-El, the Kirta Epic, Epic of Akkad, Shachar and Shalom, among many others. The most significant aspect of the Ugaritic text with respect to the Hebrew Bible is its religious content. The literature is important and the alphabet and that sort of thing is important, but the most important thing is its religious content. The texts illuminate our understanding of Canaanite gods and religious ideas that are prevalent in the Hebrew Bible. So among the pantheon are El, which is the head of the pantheon, the chief, the king. He is often called the king of old, followed by Baal, who is the weather god, often depicted carrying lightning in his arms and as a weapon. He's ready to throw a lightning rod. You also see in that iconographic image there that he is standing on top of clouds, so he is a cloud rider. Below Baal is Asherah, who is Baal's consort, his wife of sorts, and you'll recognize those two often coming together in the biblical literature, particularly in 1st and 2nd Kings. And then on the far right is Anat, the goddess of war. Some other deities of prevalence are Lotan, or Litanu, sometimes they're pronounced different ways, a seven-headed sea monster, often part of a chaos monster associated with the sea. Resheph, is a plague deity. In fact, the Hebrew word reshef is a common Hebrew word. It's not like it shows up 100 times or anything like that. It's fairly common, and it is often just translated as plague. And then the last one here on the right I have as Mot, the god of death, who was one of Baal's adversaries. He embodies the force of sterility and drought. His abode is the underworld. And he is depicted as having this wide, gaping mouth that swallows the living into his abyss, into his pit. And there are numerous other deities, and here are just a few. Dagon, the grain god, Don-El, the hero, due to his noble birth. The Rephaim, deified dead of the underworld, shows up in Job 26, among other places. Shachar, deity of the dawn. The sea, or Yam, Baal's adversary, who is often listed in parallel with Judge River. Shalom, who is usually paired with Shachar, as I mentioned earlier in the myth of Shachar and Shalom, deity of the dusk, so you have dawn and dusk together. Shapsu, which is the sun god. This would be equivalent to the Hebrew Shemesh. Yarek is the moon god, and Zabub, the fly. You might recognize him from Baal Zabub, 2 Kings 1, 2, and 3, as the Lord of the Flies. So now that I've kind of very briefly given you an outline of a little bit of the religious background of the Ugaritic text, and I apologize, there's so much more that we could go into on those texts, but that was kind of a brief sketch of that. I want to look at several Psalms then and look at how the Ugaritic literature plays into the Psalms and how they have some reflections within the Hebrew Psalter. My comments here on Psalm 29 specifically come from Trimper Longman's commentary on the book of Psalms and the Tyndale Old Testament commentary. It's a relatively new publication. But he says the following about Psalm 29. Many of the features of the psalm bear resemblances to Ugaritic poetry, raising the question of the relationship between the two. In the first place, the parallelism is highly repetitive, as in Ugaritic poetry. Secondly, the geographical references, Lebanon, Sirion, which is Mount Hermon, and Kadesh, are all in the north, even beyond the border of Israel. Thirdly, the reference to the heavenly beings, the B'nai Elim, is similar to the way in which Ugaritic texts refer to the divine assembly, the Bin Ilm. The picture of the Lord enthroned as king over the flood in verse 10 is reminiscent of the ancient Near Eastern mythic idea of the god of creation's defeat of the god of the sea. And finally, the picture of God as the power of the storm evokes a connection with Baal, the storm god and primary deity of Ugarit. These connections suggest that there is an intentional link between Psalm 29 and Ugaritic Canaanite religion. Some scholars have even concluded that Psalm 29 is an original Canaanite hymn in which the Israelite hymn writer has simply substituted the name Yahweh for Baal. Perhaps this view is correct. Otherwise, the composer has constructed his poem intentionally using these Canaanite devices and imagery. But for what purpose? The best explanation is that the Hebrew poet is stating that it is Yahweh and not Baal who is the power of the storm. In other words, the purpose would be polemical or apologetic, appealing to those Israelites who were tempted to worship Baal as the provider of the storm and the one who controlled the chaos waters. So again, that's from Trimper Longman's commentary on the Psalms. That's pages 155 if you wanted to track that down. So now let's look at Psalm 48. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king. If you know anything about your geography of Judah, Israel, you know that Jerusalem is anything but the far north. It's far north of Judah, and perhaps this psalm was written in a Judean perspective, from a Judean perspective. But generally speaking, when we talk about the north, Jerusalem doesn't fit that category. Rather, north here is the word Zaphon, which shows up in in Ugaritic literature as the Mount of Baal, that is Baal's holy place. In other words, it looks as though, not definitive here, but it looks as though Mount Zion here is replacing Zaphon as the holy place of the deity. In this case, the deity is Yahweh rather than Baal. Psalm 68. Sing to God, sing praises to his name, lift up a song to him who rides upon the clouds. His name is the Lord, be exultant before him. So when we saw the iconography of Baal, we saw that he was one who was riding upon a cloud or standing upon a cloud. And in the Ugaritic literature, he is often depicted in these terms, in this phraseology, as one who rides upon the cloud. So here we have Yahweh again replacing Baal as the one who rides upon the clouds. Psalm 74, verses 12 through 14 reads as follows. Yet God, my King, is from old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. So I want to comment on just a few things here. First of all, note that God, who is Elohim, which is an expansion of plural form of El, and El, of course, was the chief deity, the head of the pantheon, the king of old in the Ugaritic literature. So here it is Elohim who is described as the king from of old. In verse 13, you note that I marked through the definite article the. The reason I did that is because the doesn't show up in the Hebrew text. It is anarthrous. It is lacking the definite article. So we could, grammatically speaking, drop the, and if we read this in light of Ugaritic literature, we could read this as you divided Yam, you split Yam by your might. In other words, there might be some mythical elements behind this text indicating that God didn't just divide a sea like in Exodus 15, but that he actually defeated the deity sea, the deified waters. He broke the heads of the dragons, and that what lends credence to that particular interpretation is verse 14, where you crushed the heads of Leviathan. Notice that it's plural, because we saw earlier that Leviathan has 7 heads. And Lotan is Leviathan, Lotan. These are cognate words. They are depicted the same in biblical literature as they are in Ugaritic literature. And so here we have God defeating both Yam and Lotan. And then the last line, you gave him as food for creatures of the wilderness. The phrase there, or the word there for creatures, is tsiyim, which is a really bizarre Hebrew word. The meaning is uncertain. It could mean something to the effect of inhabitants of the desert, in which case there could be an allusion here to Death's realm in the underworld, or Mot's realm in the underworld. Again, those are somewhat speculative on that last line, but King of Old, Dividing Sea, and Lotan are clearly have Ugaritic reflections. And then finally look at Psalm 93, and we'll read this together. The Lord is king, he is robed in majesty, the Lord is robed, he is girded with strength. He has established the world, it shall never be moved. Your throne is established from old, you are from everlasting. So there again we have king and established from old. Again, they seem to be references to El, depictions of El. There are certainly epithets of El in the Ugaritic literature. The floods have lifted up, O Lord, and floods here is naharot, which is not the usual Hebrew word for floods, which is usually mabul. So floods here might be a reference to Judge River or Yam from the Ugaritic literature. Verse 4, more majestic than the thunders of mighty waters, more majestic than the waves of the sea. And waves of the sea is this is from the New Revised Standard Version. A more formal equivalent translation of this would be breakers of Yam. Again, sea is an arthrus. There is no article on that word. So we might say here that God is more majestic than those who even break Yam, who shattered sea. So anyway, those are some ideas about some of the reflections of different psalms. If you're curious about this idea of Ugaritic literature and the mythology behind that is found in the Ugaritic literature and how some of those things have found their ways into the Psalms or perhaps not, a good resource for this is Mitchell DeHood's commentary on the Psalms. Here I've just got an image of volume 1, but there are 3 volumes to this in the Anchor Bible Commentary series. DeHood has taken some flack because he probably stretched too far and worked a little bit too hard to find some of the parallels between the Ugaritic literature and the Psalms. However, it's a good starting point. It's a place to at least recognize that there are many places in the Psalms that have some allusions and reflections from the Ugaritic literature.